I never thought a single piece of furniture could hold the weight of a broken heart. But there I was, standing in the middle of a room filled with laughter, staring at a chair that no longer belonged to me. It was my 65th birthday, a day that was supposed to be about a lifetime of love and sacrifice. Instead, it became the day I realized I was invisible in my own family. I stood there, holding a handmade gift I had spent 6 months creating, while the people I loved most treated me like a ghost who had overstayed its welcome. When my daughter-in-law, Sarah, looked me in the eye and told me to move to the small table in the hallway, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even drop the glass of water in my hand. I just stood there, frozen. "We need the main table for people who matter for Marcus's career, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was as cold as the winter wind outside, yet she was smiling that sharp fake smile she saved for people she looked down on. "It's about priorities. I'm sure you understand." Priorities. That word felt like a physical blow to my chest. It echoed in the high ceilings of their mansion, bouncing off the expensive paintings and the crystal chandeliers. I looked at my son Marcus, the boy I had raised alone in a tiny apartment. The boy I had worked 3 jobs for, wearing shoes with holes in the soles just so he could have the best education. He didn't look at me. He didn't even flinch. He was busy pouring expensive wine for his boss, laughing at a joke I didn't hear. He heard his wife insult his mother, and he chose to keep pouring the wine. In that moment, the silence between my son and me was louder than any shout. It was the sound of 25 years of motherhood being erased in a single second. I looked at the seat that was usually mine, the one at the head of the family table. It was now occupied by Sarah's mother, a woman who had never sacrificed a single day for this family. She sat there in her silk dress, draped in diamonds, looking like a queen who had just won a war. She didn't just take my chair. She took my place in my son's heart. Most people would have caused a scene. They would have thrown the gift on the floor and demanded the respect they deserved. But as I looked at the strangers sitting around that table, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. I didn't feel like crying anymore. I felt a smile spreading across my face, a smile that wasn't for them, but for the version of me that was finally waking up. I realized then that I wasn't a guest at this party. I wasn't even family. I was just a convenience that had finally become inconvenient. I stayed. Not because I wanted to eat their food or hear their fake stories, but because I wanted to witness my own breaking point. I wanted to see exactly how far they would go. I wanted to feel every bit of the coldness so that when I finally walked away, I would never, ever look back. Sometimes you have to be completely discarded to realize that you are the only one who can truly value your own soul. And as the dinner began, I realized this wasn't the end of my life. It was the beginning of the end of theirs and mine. To understand why that moment at the dinner table felt like a knife in my soul, you have to understand the world I built for my son, brick by painful brick. My husband David passed away on a rainy Tuesday, when Marcus was only 5 years old. I remember the exact smell of the wet pavement and the way the world seemed to turn gray in an instant. Suddenly, I was a 24-year-old widow with a small child, a mortgage I couldn't afford, and a heart that was shattered into a million pieces. I made a promise to David at his funeral, whispering it into the cold air. I promised him that Marcus would never feel the sting of poverty or the shadow of being fatherless. I decided right then that my life was over and Marcus's life was all that mattered. For the next 20 years, I wasn't Eleanor, a woman with dreams of her own. I was Marcus's mother. That was my only identity, and I wore it like a badge of honor. We lived in a small, drafty house in a town called Silveridge. It was a place where the winters were long and the money was always short. To keep us afloat, I worked as a primary school assistant during the day, and when the sun went down, I put on a different uniform to wait tables at a local diner. On weekends, I cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the hill. My hands were always cracked from the cold and the cleaning chemicals, and my back had a permanent ache that never truly went away. But every time I looked at Marcus, the exhaustion vanished. I remember him sitting at our small wooden kitchen table, the one with the scratched surface, doing his homework by the light of a single lamp. I would sit across from him pretending I wasn't hungry, so he could have the last piece of chicken. "Mom, aren't you eating?" he would ask with his big, innocent eyes. I'd just pat his hand and say, "Oh, I ate a big meal at the diner, honey. You finish up. You need your brain sharp for that math test." I was his biggest cheerleader. I never missed a single soccer game, even if it meant taking a double shift at the diner the next day to make up for the lost hours. I saved every penny I could. While other women my age were buying new dresses or going on vacations, I was putting money into a jar hidden at the back of my closet. That was the Marcus University Fund. I didn't want him to just survive. I wanted him to fly. I wanted him to be the man his father would have been proud of. When Marcus got accepted into a prestigious law school in Oak Haven, I cried for 3 days straight. They were tears of pure joy. I sold my wedding ring, the only thing I had left of David, to pay for his first semester's books and housing. Marcus held me tight that day and promised, "Mom, once I'm a big lawyer, you'll never have to work again. I'll buy you a house with a garden and the softest bed in the world." I believed him. I believed him with every fiber of my being because I thought love was a debt that children felt a natural urge to repay. Then came Sarah. She entered his life like a whirlwind of silk and expensive perfume. She was the daughter of a high-powered CEO, a girl who had never known the smell of a diner or the weight of a debt. At first, I was happy. She was beautiful and smart, but I noticed small things. The way she would look at my old car with a slight curl of her lip, the way she would talk over me when I tried to share a story about Marcus's childhood. She wasn't mean, not at first. She was just superior. When they got married, the shift became more obvious. Sarah didn't want a small wedding in Silveridge. She wanted a gala at a country club. To help them, I gave them the last of my savings, $50,000, that I had intended to use for my own retirement. I told myself it was an investment in their happiness. I moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment near the train tracks so I could be closer to them. I thought being closer would mean being more involved. For the first few years, it felt okay. I was the useful grandmother. When their son Leo was born, I was there every day. I scrubbed their floors, I did their laundry, and I cooked meals that Sarah didn't know how to make. I was happy to do it. But I didn't realize that by being so useful, I was becoming a servant in their eyes. I was no longer the woman who had sacrificed everything. I was just the free help that came with the family name. Slowly, the invitations changed. Instead of, "Come over for dinner," it became, "Can you come over to watch Leo while we go to dinner?" Instead of, "How are you, Mom?" it became, "Did you remember to pick up the dry cleaning?" I felt the warmth of our relationship cooling down like a fire that no one bothered to put a log on. I noticed how Marcus started to adopt Sarah's tone, that polite, distant way of speaking to me as if I were a distant relative they only saw out of obligation. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that they were busy, that their world was high pressure and fast-paced. I convinced myself that as long as I kept giving, the love would stay. I didn't see the foundation of sand I was building on. I didn't realize that when you teach people that your feelings don't matter, they eventually start to believe you. I was setting the stage for my own disappearance, and I was doing it with a smile on my face. The transition from being a mother to being a ghost didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing process, like watching a garden die one leaf at a time. It started with the small things, the things you tell yourself aren't important until you realize they are everything. I noticed it first in the way my phone stayed silent for days, then weeks. When I did call, Marcus would sound hurried, his voice tight with a tension that I didn't know how to soothe anymore. "Mom, I'm right in the middle of something. Can we talk later?" But later never came. Then there were the family gatherings. Sarah began to host these elaborate dinner parties for their city friends, people who spoke about stocks, luxury travel, and foundations. I would sit at the table wearing my best dress, trying to join the conversation. But every time I spoke, Sarah would gently steer the topic away, as if my stories about the school or the neighborhood were embarrassing. Once I heard her whisper to a friend in the kitchen, "Eleanor is sweet, but she's from a different time. She doesn't really understand our world." I felt like an old faded photograph in a room full of bright modern art. I tried to adapt. I read the news they read. I tried to learn about the things they cared about, but the gap only grew wider. I remember one afternoon, I had brought over a basket of fresh peaches from the farmer's market, the kind Marcus used to love when he was a boy. Sarah looked at them with a frown. "Oh, Eleanor, we only eat organic farm-to-table delivery now. These might have pesticides, but thank you for thinking of us." She left the basket on the porch. I saw the neighbor's dog eating them later that evening. The real tension began when Marcus was promoted to senior partner at his firm. They bought a new mansion in the most exclusive part of the city, a place with a gate and a security guard. I was excited for them truly. But when I asked which room would be mine for when I visited, Sarah looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked at his shoes. "Actually, Mom," Marcus said, clearing his throat, "we thought it would be better if you stayed at the hotel nearby when you come. We're using the guest wing for a home office and a gym. You know how it is. Productivity is everything now." I went home that night and sat in my quiet apartment listening to the sound of the trains passing by. I realized then that the house with the softest bed Marcus had promised me as a boy was never going to happen. It wasn't about the money, it was about the space. I was being moved out of the center of his life and into the periphery. I was becoming a visitor who had to check in at a front desk. But the most painful part was watching them with Sarah's mother, Beatrice. Beatrice didn't work 3 jobs. She didn't sacrifice her youth. She had inherited her wealth and spent her days at the spa or the country club, yet she was the one they admired. She was the one Marcus would seek advice from. She was the one who had a permanent suite in their new house. Whenever she was around, I was expected to play the part of the other grandmother, the one who sat in the background while Beatrice took center stage. One weekend, I was invited over for what I thought was a casual family lunch. I had spent the morning baking my signature cinnamon rolls, the ones that make the whole house smell like heaven. When I arrived, the house was full of Beatrice's friends. Sarah looked at my rolls and sighed. "Eleanor, we're doing a gluten-free brunch today. Beatrice arranged the catering. Maybe you can take those to your senior center." I stood there holding the warm tray, feeling like a fool. I didn't take them to the center. I threw them in the trash on my way out. It was the first time I felt a spark of anger beneath the sadness. I began to see a pattern. I was only invited when they needed something, a last-minute babysitter for Leo, someone to wait for the repairman, or a family presence, for a charity event to make them look grounded. But I was never invited to the heart of the home. I was never part of the secrets, the jokes, or the future plans. I was a tool they used when necessary and put back in the shed when the job was done. The final straw before that fateful birthday dinner happened a month prior. I had been feeling a bit dizzy and had gone to the doctor. It turned out to be nothing serious, just low blood sugar, but I was scared. I called Marcus. I just wanted to hear his voice. He didn't pick up. I left a message saying I had been to the doctor and was a bit worried. He didn't call back for 3 days. When he finally did, he sounded annoyed. "Mom, you can't leave messages like that. You scared Sarah. If you're okay, just text next time. I was in a high-stakes negotiation." That was the moment I realized that my health, my fear, and my life were secondary to his negotiations. I was no longer a mother to him. I was a liability. I started to withdraw, waiting to see if they would notice. They didn't. They didn't notice my silence because they weren't listening anyway. They didn't notice I stopped bringing gifts because they didn't value them. The stage was set for the birthday dinner, a night where all the hidden coldness would finally freeze into a wall of ice that I could no longer climb. The night of my 65th birthday arrived with a heavy gray sky. I had spent hours preparing not just my appearance, but my heart. I kept telling myself, Eleanor, tonight will be different. It's a milestone. Surely today they will remember. I wore the navy blue silk blouse that David had bought me for our last anniversary. It was a bit faded, but it felt like a hug from the past. I drove to their estate, my car looking like a dusty relic among the rows of gleaming silver and black luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. When I stepped inside, the house felt colder than the outdoors. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. A waiter in a stiff tuxedo offered me a tray of appetizers I couldn't pronounce. I scanned the room for Marcus, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw him near the fireplace, surrounded by men in dark suits. He looked successful, polished, and completely unreachable. When he saw me, he didn't run over to hug me. He simply nodded a small, tight movement of his head and went back to his conversation. The dinner bell rang, a crystal-clear sound that signaled the start of my undoing. We moved into the grand dining hall. The table was a masterpiece of lace, silver, and candles. I looked for my name. I had always sat to the right of Marcus. It was our spot. But as the guests began to sit, I saw Sarah's mother, Beatrice, gracefully slide into that chair. She adjusted her pearls and looked at me with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. I stood there still holding the gift I had spent 6 months making, a quilt stitched with patches of Marcus's baby clothes, his first soccer jersey, and pieces of David's old shirts. A map of our life together. "Sarah," I whispered, leaning in as she adjusted the centerpieces. "There seems to be a mistake. Beatrice is in my seat." Sarah didn't even look up. She was checking the placement of a wine glass. "Oh, Eleanor, it's not a mistake. We had to reorganize. Marcus's firm is looking for a major investment from Beatrice's associates. We need her at the head of the table to keep the conversation flowing. It's a business dinner as much as a birthday one." "But it's my birthday, Sarah," I said, my voice trembling just a little. "It's my 65th. That's when she finally looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't guilt. It was annoyance. "Don't be difficult, Eleanor. We've set a lovely place for you at the end near the kitchen door. It's much quieter there, and you can come and go as you please without disturbing the toasts. It's about priorities. This night is about Marcus's future. I'm sure you of all people want him to succeed." I looked at Marcus. He was sitting only a few feet away. He had heard everything. Our eyes met for a split second. I expected him to stand up. I expected him to say, "Sarah, that's my mother. She sits with me." But he didn't. He looked away, picked up his glass, and toasted to a man across the table. He chose the investment over the woman who had invested her entire life in him. The weight of the quilt in my arms suddenly felt like a ton of lead. I walked slowly to the end of the table. The seat they had left for me was a folding chair tucked away behind a large floral arrangement that blocked my view of the rest of the family. I was in the room, but I was not at the table. I sat down, the fabric of the quilt resting on my lap. I could hear the clinking of silverware and the booming laughter of the important guests, but I felt like I was underwater. The final blow came during the toasts. Marcus stood up, looking every bit the man I had dreamed he would become. He spoke about success, about vision, and about the wonderful women who supported him. He thanked Sarah for her ambition. He thanked Beatrice for her invaluable guidance and wisdom. He spoke for 10 minutes, and not once, not a single time did he mention my name. He didn't mention the 3 jobs. He didn't mention the holes in my shoes. He didn't mention the woman who is currently sitting behind a vase of lilies clutching a handmade quilt. As he sat down to a round of applause, Beatrice leaned over and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "It's all about the image, darling. Some people add to it, and some people just clutter it." Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was a quiet, cold realization. The quilt, which I had thought was a treasure, now looked like a pile of rags from a life that no longer existed. I stood up. No one noticed at first. I walked to the head of the table, the quilt still in my arms. The room went quiet as I approached Marcus. Sarah looked panicked, her hand gripping her wineglass. "I'm leaving, Marcus," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. It was the steadiest it had been in years. "Mom, don't make a scene," he hissed under his breath, his face turning a dark shade of red. "We're in the middle of dinner." "You're right," I said, looking at the strangers who were staring at me. "You are in the middle of your dinner, and I am in the middle of my life. I brought you a gift, but I realize now that it doesn't fit in this house. It's made of memories, and clearly you've decided to start fresh." I laid the quilt on the floor behind his chair, not on the table, but on the floor. I looked at Sarah, then at Beatrice, and finally back at my son. "You told me tonight was about priorities. Thank you for that. You finally helped me find mine." I didn't wait for him to respond. I didn't wait for Sarah to make another excuse. I turned and walked out of that mansion, leaving the quilt, the folding chair, and the son I had lost all behind me in the shadows. The drive back to my small apartment was the quietest hour of my life. There was no music, no rain on the windshield, only the sound of my own breathing. For years, I had been terrified of silence because silence meant I was alone. But that night, the silence felt like a cool cloth on a feverish forehead. I walked into my home, turned on a single lamp, and sat down. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended at that dining table. I felt a strange, new sensation. I felt light. The next morning, the world didn't end. The sun rose over the train tracks near my building, casting a golden glow on my modest kitchen. My phone began to buzz around 10 o'clock. It was Marcus. Then a text from Sarah. Then another call. I didn't answer. For 25 years, I had jumped at every vibration of that phone, terrified that he might need me and I wouldn't be there. But now I realized the world kept spinning, even if I stayed still. A few days later, Marcus showed up at my door. He looked tired. The polish from the dinner party had worn off, and he looked like the boy I used to know, but his eyes were still full of himself. He didn't come to apologize. He came to manage the situation. "Mom, that was really embarrassing," he said before he was even fully inside. "Sarah is upset. My colleagues are asking questions. You can't just walk out like that. It was unprofessional." I looked at him, really looked at him. I didn't see the successful lawyer or the son I had worshipped. I saw a man who had lost his way so deeply that he thought a mother's heart was a matter of professionalism. "Marcus," I said, my voice calm and low, "I am not your employee. I am not your babysitter, and I am no longer your safety net. You didn't ask if I was okay. You didn't ask why I walked out. You only asked how it made you look." He started to argue, to tell me about the pressures of his life, about how hard he worked. I stayed silent. I let his words bounce off me like pebbles against a stone wall. When he finally ran out of breath, I told him I needed space. Not a week, not a month, but space to remember who Eleanor was before she became a servant to his ambition. I closed the door on him, not with anger, but with a firm, steady hand. I began to change my life in small, defiant ways. I took the money I had been saving for emergencies, which usually meant helping Marcus with his problems, and I booked a trip. Not a fancy one, just a week at a quiet cabin by the lake where David and I used to go. I started to paint again, something I hadn't done since I was 20. I realized that my hands, the ones I thought were only good for scrubbing and serving, could create something beautiful. I made new friends. Not people with titles or foundations, but people who liked the way I brewed tea and the stories I told about the books I read. I joined a gardening club where the only priority was the health of the roses. I learned that respect isn't something you beg for. It's the air you breathe when you finally stop suffocating yourself for the sake of others. Sarah tried to call me a month later, sounding frantic. She needed me to watch Leo because their nanny had quit and they had a gala to attend. "Eleanor, we really need you. It's a huge night for us," she pleaded. I looked at my calendar. I had a painting class that evening. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said. "I have a prior commitment. My priorities have shifted." The silence on the other end of the line was the most honest conversation we had ever had. She realized then that the convenience was gone. I wasn't being mean. I was being whole. I spent that evening painting the sunset, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. I was learning that choosing yourself isn't an act of selfishness. It's an act of survival. My relationship with Marcus is still distant, and perhaps it always will be. But the distance isn't a wall. It's a boundary. He is learning that his mother is a person with a soul, not just a resource to be tapped. And I am learning that the most important seat at any table is the one you keep for yourself. I found my peace not in their mansion, but in the quiet strength of my own reflection. As I sit here today on my small porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realize that the empty chair at that dinner table was the greatest gift I ever received. For a long time, I thought that being a mother meant disappearing. I thought that the more I gave, the more I would be loved. I believed that my value was measured by how much of myself I could pour into others until I was nothing but an empty vessel. I was wrong. Love is not a transaction where you trade your dignity for a place at someone's table. True love, the kind that lasts and heals, is built on a foundation of mutual respect. If you don't respect yourself enough to walk away from where you are not valued, you are not teaching people how to love you. You are teaching them how to use you. It took me 65 years and a painful night in a cold hallway to understand that I am responsible for my own light. To anyone listening who feels like they are becoming a ghost in their own family, who feels like their sacrifices have become invisible, please listen to me. Your worth is not defined by your usefulness. You are not a tool, a servant, or an afterthought. You are a human being with a heart that deserves to be cherished, not just managed. It is never too late to reclaim your name, your time, and your joy. Marcus and I are slowly finding a new way to be mother and son. It's not the same as before. It's more honest now. There are no more fake smiles and no more one-sided sacrifices. He is learning that my love is a gift, not a debt he can ignore. And I am learning that I can love him deeply without losing myself in the process. We don't see each other as often, but when we do, The air is clearer. I still have that quilt, the one I left on the floor. Marcus brought it back to me a few months ago, freshly cleaned and folded. He didn't say much, but he held it with care. It's now draped over my favorite chair by the window. It serves as a reminder of where I came from and the strength I found when I thought I had nothing left. It's a map of my past, but it no longer dictates my future. Life is quiet now, but it is a full kind of quiet. I have learned to appreciate the taste of a simple cup of tea, the sound of the wind in the trees, and the peace of a home where I am always the guest of honor. I no longer wait for an invitation to feel important. I have realized that the most important seat in the world isn't at the head of a fancy table. It's the one inside your own heart where you finally decide that you are enough. So tonight, as the stars come out, I want you to remember this. Don't be afraid of the silence. Don't be afraid to walk away from the table when respect is no longer being served. You might lose a seat, but you will find your soul. And in the end, that is the only priority that truly matters. Sleep well, knowing that you are worthy of a love that sees you, honors you, and always makes room for you.